Chuck Jones as a man was an intellectual. Chuck could quote Aristophanes or Mark Twain at the drop of a pegboard. Brilliant man, besides being handsome.
A delightful kind of courtly man in a way. I mean, he loved wearing a hat, and he loved kissing hands, and he loved all that kind of thing. He was skipped 3 grades when he was young. He was a determined kid, Stanford IQ testing thing. And so they jumped him 3 grades. So he was a young guy in high school, which is miserable for a boy to be 2 or 3 years younger than all of them. So he dropped out, and his father put him in art school. He wasn't a jokester, as I suppose some people might think, you know, always telling jokes and all that kind of thing. He was actually kind of a very private person and loved to read. His recommendation for anybody getting an education was to read and read and read some more. And that's how he got his education.
I thought he was the intellectual of the animation industry at that time.
We personally were very private. We had a very private life. We both had our own space. I mean, our house is U-shaped, and his workroom was there and mine was over here, and we didn't bother each other, you know, when we were working. Sometimes they say, well, my spouse is my best critic and that kind of thing. Well, that wasn't true. He said artists need love, not criticism, and so, you know, from everybody, and particularly their spouse. He drew every day. I mean, he was always drawing, whether it was when he was on the phone or whatever. He also was very good at public speaking. Chuck could talk about animation, and he had a wit that was absolutely brilliant.
He's really the biggest source of inspiration for me in my career. He really is, you know. I was so taken with his work, and I think it's Chuck that made me realize the importance of a director in an animated film. Chuck's work in the 1970s is very, very different from his previous Warner Brothers work. You know, there was a period after he left Warner Brothers where he was at MGM, and he started doing experiments. He was doing Tom and Jerry cartoons. Once he left MGM and formed Chuck Jones Enterprises and started to do television specials, I think his work became more personal. He loved reading, you know, and read all the classics, knew them backwards and forwards, and he loved Kipling. When he did the Kipling work, he was feeling that he was trying to do the original material justice. He's trying to treat the material, you know, with a lot of respect. To a certain extent, his feeling was that although Jungle Book at Disney's was a marvelous film, it wasn't Kipling enough. It's one reason he wanted to make Mowgli's Brothers, and he continued to pronounce it Mowgli as opposed to the Disney Mowgli, because he felt that was really the intended Kipling pronunciation. Chuck was an experimenter. He was a visual experimenter. To be sure, they all have that patina of his drawing on it. But he is going in different directions, and I think to a certain extent that's one reason that this work is important, because it was as important to him to do service to good literature during that period in his life and treat it with a different kind of a drawing style and animation style as it was for him to be able to get a laugh. I loved all the Warner Brothers cartoons and watched them incessantly, and yet there were some that made me laugh more. Why did they make me laugh? And they were really animated well. And so I started looking at the credits, and almost all the ones that I really loved were, you know, Charles M. Jones. And I think as a director, Chuck's strong suits were, first of all, his timing, you know, was impeccable. You know, he used to say that for the coyote falling off the cliff, he had to disappear for 14 frames before the puff of smoke came up. Not 12 frames, not 13 frames, 14 frames. You know, that would get the laugh. Chuck did something that I think very few animation directors have done. Because of the elegance of his drawing and his poses, which were both expressive and beautifully drafted, he managed to make elegant animation that was really funny. It gave it a sophistication, a wit, if you will, that a lot of animation directing does not have.
Harry? Are you all right, Harry?
When he wants a character to change attitude with these elongated smear drawings, there's never an anticipation to it. You never have a character going, you know, down and then moving. You could, but Chuck doesn't. He likes the split-second timing of starting to fold out of the previous key, then the big smear, and then, you know, one or two more drawings, you know, folding up into the next key. It's almost always 3 or 4 frames when he does it. If he did it for any longer, it would look goony. In Rikki Tikki Tavi, he uses this. He does let it last a little bit longer because he's doing something graphic with it. He was not just saying he's changing attitudes because he's doing a quick burlesque, but rather this is the speed and the graphic that the character makes. For Rikki Tikki Tavi, you know, and White Seal and others, you know, Chuck studied the anatomies of those characters, of those animals, how they moved, in order to get something that looked very, very believable on the screen.
I did quite a bit of research on Rikki Tikki Tavi because it was an era, the Kipling era, and we wanted to get things correctly done. So I found an old film, Hollywood film, that had a clip of a mongoose and a cobra fighting. And it was from India, a little film clip. Chuck put it on a moviola, and he timed exactly how fast the cobra struck and how the mongoose would just pull back just exactly in time so he wasn't hit. And it was incredibly fast. It was just the most amazing thing. He put that all into the film, and it made a very dramatic film and a scary one for some little young people.
I recognized that he was going for something different than he had done in the past. First of all, he had more subtle voice work here and there, and I'm the world's biggest Mel Blanc fan, and Mel actually did do some work on, you know, some of those films in the 70s, but he would have Orson Welles, for example, narrating and doing the voice of the cobra, and it gave it a kind of power and a kind of weight that it wouldn't have had.
The great god Brahm put his mark upon all our people when the first cobra spread his hood to keep the sun off Brahm.
You know, he had Roddy McDowell, he had various other people providing voices, and it's a very different pace. When those cobras are on screen, it's slow, it's deliberate, and it scares you because you know they're about to strike. And that's very different from anything that he had done, you know, in gag cartoons. You know, he's really playing that seductive feel of a cobra, you know, and you don't know exactly when it's going to make its move. You know, he does it with the staging, he does it with the voice work, and I think it's a very, very different approach for him to take.
He called me to do Nagina, the snake. Orson Welles, of course, was my husband. And I just wondered, what kind of a voice would I use for the snake? I thought a snake would hiss. And so I kind of hissed a little bit in Nagina.
If you move, I strike. And if you do not move, I strike.
It was really a joy to him to be able to do those half-hour specials because it was a nice time frame. It wasn't too long, it wasn't a feature, but it was just enough to tell a wonderful story. Very, very different. I think he was experimenting and having a chance to experiment, which he really didn't at Warner Brothers in that way. The opening of Rikki, and there's a little bit of an Orson Welles touch there. He wanted to get the Jungle Book done the way it was written, which was fantastic and magical and marvelous.
This is all based on observation. You know, it's broadened, it's caricatured. Although I have to say, in the case of the Kipling specials and a lot of the films that Chuck made in the 70s, Cricket and Times Square, they were far more based on Chuck's fine art drawing style. And I think that's one reason that they're very unique. You know, he would make drawings of children, he would make drawings of animals that were very, very like those that show up in Cricket in Times Square and Rikki Tikki Tavi and White Seal and so forth. And it's interesting because it's not as cartoony, it's not as broad, there's more structure in it, there's kind of more draftsmanship, if you will, even though the draftsmanship in the classic Warner's cartoons is superlative. This is a different kind of draftsmanship. This is really based on observation. One of the things that I love about Cricket in Times Square is when the entire city of New York stops and freezes to listen to this beautiful violin. It's basically panning across actual Chuck Jones drawings that were just Xeroxed and painted onto the cell. And they're fantastic. You know, just observing those drawings and how well he realized the various denizens of New York as they're listening, rapt to this wonderful violin playing. It's breathtaking. You just realize what a superlative artist and draftsman Chuck was. And throughout the Kipling specials as well, you know, those types of drawings were more of what he liked to do in terms of his own personal drawing as opposed to a Warner Brothers house style. And so it doesn't mean he didn't have that cartooniness in him. He absolutely did. But, you know, this was a slightly different direction. You could say even a little bit more personal.
I think anybody who wants to be an animator, you have to be born to have talent to draw. You have to be. But I think Chuck led the way. I really do. I think he and Tex Avery had their own form of animation, and there's just nobody like him. And once you see something that Chuck has drawn, you know it's Chuck's.
In the last year of his life, he had a lot of health problems, so he was not feeling good at all. Then I'd get up really early in the morning and go walking. So he was usually asleep, and so I'd leave a note for him, And one morning I came back, and by the coffee pot there, he'd taken the note and done a drawing, and with a little comment. There developed a whole cast of characters which were worms, and they were a very funny whole group of characters. And I have about 60 or 70 of those drawings, and there'd be a little comment, and it was so humorous and so full of fun, and it just, that was still with him.
You know, I think Chuck's place in animation history is solid and ongoing. You know, it didn't just stop even though Chuck passed away. You know, all of this work is worth returning to and understanding why it works the way that it does. Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, Francis Ford Coppola, they were all, Martin Scorsese, Joe Dante, they're all Chuck Jones fans. They all understand what Chuck brought to the table, not just as an animation director, but as a director. You can talk about Chuck's range as an artist, as a filmmaker, and that's part of his lasting legacy. And also part of his lasting legacy is what he can do with one frame and how that makes a difference as to how you respond to a character. You know, it goes from the huge to the minutiae, and Chuck did it all.
Rikki had a right to be proud of himself, but he did not grow too proud. And he kept that garden as a mongoose should keep it, with tooth and jump and spring and bite, till never a cobra dared show its head inside the wall.